Dear audience, kindly make sure that your mobile phone are switched off or silenced. Respected audience, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On behalf of His Excellency Professor Jamal Sanad al-Suwaidi, Director General of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, in conjunction with the Emirates Innovation Month, we would like to welcome you this evening to a lecture titled Responsible Use of Innovation and Technology to Ensure Sustainability, to be delivered by Mr. Kaiser Naseem, CEO of Tech Platforms and International Development Banker. Mr. Naseem is a respected thought leader in international development finance, working in all aspects of development, banking in challenging environments, and with institutions such as the World Bank. Mr. Naseem sits on the board of several international organizations and has been named among the top fintech influencers for CDGs. Now I would like to invite Mr. Naseem to deliver his lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I'll just stand up. Let me start with thanking you, Deputy Director General and His Excellency Jamal al-Suwaidi, who unfortunately can't be with us, the Director General of the Center. So I'm very grateful to you for having me here, inviting me to this prestigious institution to talk about what I think all of us are beginning to understand is very important, which is responsible innovation and responsible use of technology. But before I actually talk about responsible use of technology or innovation, let me just set this context, why we are talking about being responsible. So dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you all also for being here to listen to this. I think it's an important part of what we do in 2020 onwards, actually what we've been doing since 2015 maybe, going forward. And just for the context, let me actually quote from a book by Yuval Harari. I'm sure all of you must have read that book, which is called Sapiens. And if my virtual assistant is not asleep, it's past her working hours, I'll ask her to talk about it, one of the benefits of using artificial intelligence. So Siri, if you're still awake, could you give a quote from the book of Yuval Harari?
Says, in his best-selling book called Sapiens, Yuval Harari writes, "We are more powerful than ever before, but have very little idea what to do with all that power. Worse still, humans seem to be more irresponsible than ever before and are consequently wreaking havoc on our fellow animals and the ecosystem, seeking little more than our own amusement, yet never finding satisfaction." And to paraphrase him further, is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So basically what he's saying, and if we've read Sapiens, so he talked about the fourth industrial revolution, which we're all in right now, which is technology. And he's talking about irresponsible behavior of sapiens, of us, of human beings, who think themselves as God and try and use the tools at their disposal for sometimes not the benefit of society as a whole, but for their own personal gains. So that's the context. And why this context is important today is because we have a very powerful tool in our hands, as all of us know. And in 2020, I am sure there is no one in this room, or perhaps even in this country, maybe on the planet there still may be some who have not been touched by or disrupted by technology. It could be the way we order our food. It could be the way we hail a cab. It could be the way we bank and use and manage our finances. We've all seen a big change, especially in the last 5 or 6 years. A lot of it is obviously in reaction to a demand by the clients, which is us, that we want to be more satisfied with the way we order our food, with the way we bank, etc. And we want to have it immediately. We don't want to wait in big lines to cash a check. So we're using this technology to our advantage, and the innovators of this technology have addressed that pain point of demand by clients. And that's why we see this disruption taking place. I'm sure all of us are aware of that, but I will just briefly talk about what this disruption is, and I'll just stick to the financial sector. I mean, we've disrupted everything around us, health, agriculture, energy, but I'll stick to finance because that's the sector I worked in mostly, but it applies across the board. So this disruption basically started maybe 10 years ago, and I mean, we like to say it was after the crisis when banks went bust and there was a big gap in the financial segment in terms of accessing finance, for example, in terms of being able to manage assets. So then we saw a lot of these financial technology platforms come in to take this space, what we call fintechs today, and they started offering these services. We saw the likes of Lending Club, we saw the likes of Amazon, actually we're more familiar with that, and Facebook rising in that period because of the fact that there was a gap in the way information was disseminated and in which the way in products and services were provided. 5 years into this sort of a disruption, the institutions, and again financial institutions, but all institutions started getting worried that, look, for the first few years, they were not really worried. They said these small platforms are not going to be able to do anything to us because, they're too big to fail mantra. And these were legacy institutions which were established for years. So they weren't really scared of these platforms till they started actually eating into their market segments. And it started with the retail business, again in the financial sector, and with the small and medium enterprise sector. So these large banks started losing market share because of what these platforms were offering, both in terms of services and in terms of products. So that's when they were disrupting, it was called FinTech 1, when the banks were not scared. Then the battle started of competing. So banks started trying to put in place their own digital platforms, their own technology to counter these new platforms and the new challenger banks, as we call them now. But that's where the hurdle was, and again, this is a talk of a separate lecture, that it wasn't easy for these legacy institutions to leverage this technology. And there's a host of reasons for that. Most of us must be familiar with it. One of them is legacy. The other is mindset, which is the biggest thing. And that's why I was happy to see your training institute here. I mean, those are the things that need to be worked on. So legacy institutions could not keep pace, and the lending clubs and the emerging circles and the Amazons kept on growing because the big giants could not catch up. Till both of these platforms, the banks, the legacy banks, and these new platforms also hit a wall. And that wall was in terms of the platforms, they could not scale. So if they had a lending product, or if they had a product which could deliver or a platform which could deliver a product faster, they didn't have the client base because it was new, they were small, and the banks had the clientele. They had 500,000, 1 million, 2 million, depending on the jurisdiction. So then arose FinTech 2, wherein the partnerships between the financial technology company platforms and banks started happening. And for those of you who are interested, a very good case study of this is BBVA Bank in Spain, how they went through this digital journey of transforming their legacy core platforms into digital, and what they did, and there were obstacles along the way. So FinTech 2 is where these partnerships have started. So we've seen that happen, that when banks now, especially in emerging economies and emerging markets, are trying to leverage technology, they're not innovating themselves anymore, as they started doing, and they failed because of mindsets and legacy systems. So what they're now doing is that they are looking at platforms which are being set up by entrepreneurs and either partnering with them or acquiring them or having some sort of a relationship. So the technology is provided by these by these entrepreneurs, and the market or the client base is provided by the legacy institutions. So that's what we see happening now. Now that's where the issues come in. And during all this period, we all learned. I mean, no one actually really knew where we were headed 10 years ago. I mean, frankly, we don't even know where we're headed today. But in terms of data, I mean, let me just come straight to that. We were not really, we had the ability to leverage digital technology and these platforms to swiftly deliver products, to perhaps assess credit risk in a more, well, the turnaround time would be faster, but we weren't using enough data. And there was a lot of data sitting with the banks who had this client base, and they had the names and addresses and their job descriptions and what type of business, but they've never leveraged that data. So I think around 2006, 2007, 2008, when we started hearing that data is the fuel which drives technology and data is the new oil. So it is, because it is data which enables technology. So technology is a tool. Just keep that at the back of your mind, that technology is the tool, and that tool is useless unless you have some raw material which that technology can process. And that raw material or that fuel is data. And today, or 2-3 years ago also, when we discovered machine learning and artificial intelligence, we didn't discover it, it's been going on maybe for more than 30, 50 years, but the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence was more because of the fact that different institutions wanted to reach out deeper into the market. We've also heard of, I'm a development banker, we've also heard of technology being used for financial inclusion. So one of the SDGs, which we have to achieve by 2030 is financial inclusion. And technology enables that, again, because of the fact that it is able to more quickly deliver the projects and finances, but not only that, it is able to assess the risk of the unbanked faster. The reason we have financial exclusion is because the financial institutions have not been able to assess the risk involved in having a relationship with such individuals, and they've been excluded. So there are about 1.7 billion on the planet today, which has come down. There's a World Bank report, it's called the Findex Index. I don't know if you know that, but if anyone is interested in financial inclusion, it's published every 4 years, and it gives you the number of unbanked globally. So the fastest fall was in the period between 2014 and 18. The last was published in 18, so it's 2 years old. Next will be 22. It was about 600 million people were brought out of being financially excluded. And we like to think it was because of technology, because of the use of technology. So technology is a tool which we have now at our disposal as sapiens, as human beings. It has been used, and I'll get into how it has been misused also. And again, a lot of us are familiar with how it has been misused, but I'll just quote a few examples. Because like any tool, it's a double-edged sword. And once you embark on this journey of digitalization, especially if you're a legacy institution, you want to acquire this. You like to just leverage this technology and start doing whatever it is that you are doing, without realizing that sometimes the technology may not be providing you with the right solution, or it may not be geared towards what the institution intends to do. And we've realized that now. And that's where the responsibility comes in. So like I like to say, and we've all learned that in school, that knowledge gives us great power. And this technology is new knowledge for us to be used. So technology gives great power. But we also learned from Spider-Man, for those of us who's watched it, that with great power comes great responsibility. So that's the piece which has been missing. And the reason I stress on that, by the way, is because I worked in governance as well, and many of us may have done that, corporate governance. So if you go back to 2000, and you go back to Enron, and you go back to Sarbanes-Oxley, and then going forward, we've had so many codes being published on corporate governance, and we've had so many board directors being trained on corporate governance. And even today, you pick up the newspaper and you will at least see, just in the region, 10 corporate governance failures happening. So, and it's mostly because of ethical reasons. So you have the best code, and Enron, by the way, had the best code of corporate governance in 2000. They had the best code of corporate governance. We're familiar with Enron, right? And that code was sold on eBay for 10 cents when that company collapsed. So responsible innovation. Why do we need to be responsible when we are innovating as entrepreneurs? And that's why, a lot of what I say or I talk about, especially in the last 6, 7, 8 months, is directed more towards entrepreneurs, the younger entrepreneurs, who are embarking on this journey of putting together a technology platform, which in their minds, they hope to leverage a big corporate and work with them and provide the necessary services. We've seen platforms, again, Lending Club is one example, which a bank used to start lending to the unbanked on their portfolio, and only to find out that the algorithms, because when you're using data and you're processing it or analyzing it, you have to write algorithms for that. So these are mathematical formulas which work like the human brain, but probably millions or billion times faster than that. And the problem is, if that algorithm is not the correct one, you will get the wrong results. So we knew that, I think, at least when I started university, GIGO, garbage in and garbage out. So that still holds true today. So it wasn't realized those algorithms for processing using mathematical formulas which were not accurate, and hence a lot of non-credible clients or businesses were getting loans from that big bank in the USA. And this went on and on for years till they were finally found out that, why is our loan portfolio going south? It was 5% before we started using technology, and now it's 15%. Algorithms have been used by recruitment firms, by human resource firms to recruit. They're being used a lot now. And there have been scandals in no other company than Amazon, when they discovered less than a year ago, that the algorithms are biased. So that's the other thing that creeps in. The algorithms are biased because they've been written by a human. And when a human in an Amazon sort of an environment is interviewing people to recruit, they're looking at, okay, 1 woman and 8 men, and 6 white men and 1 black man. That's the bias, human bias, unfortunately. I'm just giving an example. And that goes into the algorithm. So the algorithm is biased, and that went on for years, and Amazon has just corrected it and found out. Apple and Goldman Sachs issued a credit card. I'm sure we all read about that 2 months ago, 3 months ago. And of all people who used it, what's his first name? But Wozniak, one of the founders of Apple, right? There were 2 founders, so Wozniak, one of the founders, and his wife had a similar credit card, and they had a similar job, and so her credit was refused and his were accepted because she was female and he was, and there was a bias, and Apple later acknowledged it. So these are biases. And that's why when you are innovating and when you're offering an algorithm or a technology platform to someone like JP Morgan or Citibank or Emirates NBD, Mashreq, the innovator needs to ensure that there are no biases in that algorithm. So that's the innovation part. The responsibility of the user of the technology, Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Facebook has all the data in the world, right? Probably they have the most data on all of us. But they were not able to control the way that data was being used by Cambridge Analytica, and they had this big scandal. So as users of technology also, one has to be responsible. And this responsibility will not just come because I'm telling you to do that or someone tells you that you've got to be responsible. It will come because there's a business case for being responsible. And especially if you're entrepreneurs, you should realize that there is a business case, and that's what needs to be stressed. Because just telling someone to be honest is not going to work. But telling someone that if you're not honest, you will not sustain your business is what works. And we're seeing that happen when we're looking at SDGs right now. And I think this country where we are standing right now is an excellent example of how these things are being implemented in terms of ensuring that companies are adhering to sustainable development, sustainable investing. Companies are adhering to ESG, environment and social and governance laws, by making them understand that if they are irresponsible, They will not be sustainable. And why is that so? Why won't they be sustainable? The other thing I like to say is that regulatory frameworks, right? They are regulatory frameworks, and the banks are the most regulated sort of institutions globally because of the nature of work that they do. Innovation is always ahead of regulatory frameworks. It outpaces regulatory frameworks. Regulations are always catching up with innovation, and we're seeing that happen. We're seeing it happen in this country also. You don't have regulatory frameworks adequate enough, even for 5G. We're launching 5G, or for blockchain, for example, or even for use of data. But it is being used because innovators are entrepreneurs, and they do not wait for regulations to come in place, and they start offering their services, which is good. I mean, that's how you advance. You have an innovation. But unless the innovator is responsible, you can end up being in a mess. And that's where this comes in, because regulations will follow innovation, and if the innovation itself is unethical, the regulatory framework which will follow, I can tell you, is going to be so stringent that it might stifle innovation. And I don't think it's in anyone's interest as innovators, as entrepreneurs, to have a regulatory framework which doesn't allow you to innovate. So just for that reason, if an entrepreneur has that vision, one would always make sure that the regulatory framework becomes more conducive. Today, because of the irresponsible behavior of Facebook, I keep repeating that, and they're always in the news, he's been grilled by the US Senate, by the European Union, and I can bet you the type of regulatory framework that these regulators are now thinking of on the use of data and the sourcing of data and how you organize the data is going to be very stringent. They haven't figured it out yet, but they know that this guy is going to misuse it again. And I mean, you see them, how he's been grilled. So these are the pitfalls of not being responsible. These are the pitfalls of when we talk about sustainability, that we, especially in the region we are in and the country that we are in, which I think is at the forefront of technology and innovation, and that's because of the environment that has been created here. We should not let that happen. We should not let, because even if you have the best regulatory frameworks and most conducive in the UAE, it's a global world now. So, and an innovator, we talked about scale, an innovator cannot just remain in the UAE and scale. It cannot happen. The UAE is creating global companies. And global companies means you have to abide by GDPR. You have to abide by the rules in the US. You have to abide by the digital banking laws of Singapore and Hong Kong if you want to go into those markets. So how does that happen? It only happens if those laws are conducive enough for you also. So even if you're innovating in FinTech Hive or in ADGM in the UAE, the vision should be broader, that your innovation is going to be working in, let's say, in Moscow in the next 3 years. So we need to make sure that the way we are collecting data and the way we are analyzing that data is in line with the regulatory framework, which would still be emerging in Moscow or even in Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong and Singapore just 6 months ago went into digital banking, and they're offering 6 licenses. I think ADGM is also doing that now. But they've stepped into this. I mean, again, just talking about regulations, let's talk about ADGM. They've stepped into this. They started offering the licenses for setting up digital banks. Without the regulatory framework will evolve around that. No one really knows what will happen when you give a license for digital banking, how it is going to operate. So depending on how the owner of that license will move forward with that responsibility is how the regulatory framework will be framed, and that will provide a conducive environment for other entrepreneurs to come in and actually set the stage for a more digitalized financial sector, if we're talking about that. And what I have said actually applies equally to energy efficiency. It applies equally to agriculture, productivity. Again, I can think of an app which had the wrong algorithms for agri-finance. It was in one of the North African countries. I won't name the country. So the yield, the way a bank decides how to lend to a farmer, this again is the beauty of technology, because farmers normally they have no relationship with banks. They get finance from the middlemen, and they pay like 50, 60, 70% a month to them. So if banks can provide them funding, you can raise the standard of living of farmers because then they get direct financing. But the banks have no way to assess the risk involved in lending to someone who's growing a crop. And technology offers us that opportunity to allow banks to understand that if a farmer has 1 acre of land and he's sowing, let's say, wheat on it, and it's in a particular geography, so the yield per acre should be so much. The technology gives you the prices of that wheat per ton for the last 5 years or 6 years. So you can quickly calculate that this farmer can earn $1,000 a month, so we can give him $500. But if your algorithm has calculated that the yield here will be 100 tons an acre, and it's actually 5 tons an acre, so the bank is going to lose money. So this is where responsibility testing, making sure there's a fairness in algorithms comes in. And based on the history and the track record of how responsible this algorithm or technology platform or fintech, or you can name it whatever, but this platform which received data, processed that data, and offered it to an institution to use to start having a relationship with people, how responsible was that would depend on how responsible the innovation itself is. And on that would depend what the regulatory framework would be. I'll just end here. I think I have another 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and then we have question and answer. Okay, it's right there. Okay. So the other thing which I would like to stress on is we talked about sustainability development goals. And since we're talking about technology, and since we're talking about responsibility and ethics and governance, so we're all familiar with the 17 SDGs, right? And I think this country has just a week ago, there was a conference on this in Abu Dhabi on sustainability development. So all businesses, and again, all innovations need to incorporate sustainability development goals in their business targets. It's not easy to do. There needs to be an understanding. I was actually at Davos last week also, and there the theme, cross-cutting, was sustainability and how sustainable development goals can be embedded. And a lot of companies were at a loss. And I'm sure you saw some announcements right after Davos, again, JP Morgan, and they jumped in and they said, okay, we're not going to lend money to someone who doesn't have one woman on their board from now on. I hope they do that. I don't know, because a lot of people pay a lot of lip service. But these are the things: women empowerment, gender equality, food security, financial inclusion, poverty alleviation. These are the goals. And each business can adapt 1 or 2 goals. You don't have to hit all 17 of them. And they can be embedded. For example, if you're an agri-processing company in our land, for example, and they're already doing it actually, but similar examples, you can embed food security, that you are making an environment in the UAE to ensure that not 50% or 80% of your food is imported, but next year it'll be less than 50%. It'll be homegrown. So you're securing it. In the next 20 years, you want to make the country able to feed not only itself, but perhaps a few neighboring countries in Africa, in Asia, where there is not enough water, for example, or enough technology to improve the yields per acre. So that's food security. And these could be embedded in your business targets. And the reason they should be embedded is because nowadays, sustainable investing is picking up. And there was a pitch at Davos. I was at one of the events where technology firms are pitching. And there were questions, okay, what will your platform do and how you... My only question to him was, where have you embedded sustainable development goals in what you're doing? And he didn't have an answer then, but I answered it for him, and there were other people in the room who answered it. So whatever you do, because unless you have that embedded in you, your valuation, and this is already happening, mind you have sustainable investment funds going on, your valuation is not going to be as good as it is if you have sustainability in your business plan or in your business targets. So that's another business reason you should do it. And I keep stressing that because, I've worked in the private sector on behalf of the World Bank for about 30 years with private sector, helping them develop. And I'm sure there are a lot of private sector people here, but goodness of the heart is good. You can tell them. But end of the day, it's profits. Stakeholders want that. So how does profitability, how does not being sustainable or responsible hamper profitability? And that's what it hits. That's what hit JP Morgan Because people are actually now looking at boards of companies and saying, you don't have any woman director, your share value is not going to be 100 dirhams, it'll be 80 dirhams, as far as I'm concerned. So it started to happen. It started to happen in ESG in 2008 and 2009. And just quickly, we know that for a fact because the institution I was working for, we would set up stock exchanges. We set up one in Brazil, actually, Novo Mercado, where only stocks with good corporate governance were listed. And there's one in Egypt, and there's several now, but I'm talking about 2008. And we monitored it for the next 5 years, and consistently, the stock market where you had better governed companies listed outperformed the other index. And it still does in many jurisdictions. So there is a business case for being responsible in the way you innovate, in the way you use the technology, and actually in the way we run our companies, we run our governments, because sustainability means sustainability for not the stakeholders of that entity, but the stakeholders of the world, of the globe. Thank you very much. So, of course, any questions, most welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Naseem, for such an informative lecture on how innovation and technology can be better leveraged to provide maximum benefit to companies and society. Now we open the floor for discussion. If you wish to ask a question or provide a comment, kindly stand up and introduce yourself. And please keep your questions and comments brief to allow for other members of the audience to participate. Any question? Yeah.
هل الحوكمة وأخلاقيات الحوكمة تعيق تطور الابتكار والتكنولوجيا؟ لأن أكثر مثلا بعض الدول تحاول أن تبتعد عن مسار الحوكمة في تطبيق الابتكار والتكنولوجيا، بعكس مثلا الحمد لله وشكر الله في دولة الإمارات لأي عمل نجد أن الحوكمة والأخلاقيات معيار مهم في تطبيق أي تطور موجود في دولة الإمارات. فلماذا لا تحذو الدول المتقدمة حذو دولة الإمارات في تطبيق الحوكمة ما دام يخدم الإنسانية والحضارة؟ شكرا.
Excellent question. And look, the short answer is that in the short run, it might work. But like I mentioned, and I think we know, and especially like you said in the UAE, it's proven that it's not sustainable. Because anything you do, I mean, it's not just technology, but any business that you do, unless it is governed properly, it's true for businesses, it's true for countries, it is not going to sustain itself in the long run. And like we discussed earlier, it is now reflected. I mean, there have been studies done, it is reflected in the share value or the valuation of companies. And it is also reflected in the valuation of countries now. So when you look at, the Moody's rating or the other ratings or the enabling business environment, which the World Bank does, governance is a big part of it. And ethics is a big part of governance. And I like to say, I actually taught corporate governance, and I've taught it also in Haukama. We actually set up Haukama, again, 2007 as IFC. I like to say it, I mean, it may sound a bit odd in, in such a gathering, but end of the day, the best course of corporate governance will not really have an impact unless this thing is in the right place, right? This thing here. And that's actually what we should start thinking of. How do we change our mindsets? When we talk about mindsets, I mean, we tap here, but this is where the mindset comes from, actually. So, I mean, that's it. I can give a longer answer, but let this suffice.
Thank you. Another question? Please, Dr. Anas.
Thank you, Ms. Ahmed. Good evening. Thank you so much for this very informative lecture. The data's journey starts with data, information, as you said, to knowledge, and then wisdom. So we have to wisely use the knowledge that we have. And we have so many examples like CRISPR, what the scientists done in China, playing God with our genes. And as you mentioned, Cambridge Analytica, they're playing with our personal data. I don't know what they've done with it, except with these, tampering with the elections in the United States. But my question is regarding banks. What guidelines or guarantees we have that the banks really apply ethical guidelines or governing our data that they have their own in the most ethical way, because basically banks are like silos to us. We don't know what's happening inside. So what guidelines or that can banks provide to us in order to make sure that to rest assured that our data is protected and being managed in the most ethical way? Thank you.
Right. Well, first of all, I don't think there are any guarantees. But the thing about banks, actually, and one of the reasons that banks still exist, although if you go back, I think 20 years or maybe 15 years, Bill Gates said, and I think he's right, he said that banking is necessary, but banks are not. So we're seeing banks going away, but we haven't seen them go away fast enough because they have a trust element. So we have a relationship. So that's one thing that banks offer, that we've trusted them for so many years, and we have a bank, so that element is there. Now, in the age of technology, the bank themselves also wouldn't know whether the data is safe or not, unfortunately today. Because these algorithms that we spoke about, and again, most of us would know, they are black boxes actually, right? No one really knows what's in them and how they're calculating the risk. And the banks have just acquired those. They've not written the algorithms, they've acquired it from an entrepreneur. So the bank also doesn't know. So that's where the responsibility of banks comes in, that they should know. So this is starting to happen, and that's where regulatory frameworks come in. So this is something where the regulators thought, oh, okay, so this is happening in data, so maybe there's something we need to put in place for data. So GDPR, we're all familiar with that in the European Union. 2018, right, that's when it started. It was because of this. So the type of data, so the ownership of the data is with you now. So you can tell how the data is to be used. But still, the algorithm is still a black box. So now what's happening globally, and this is evolving. That's why I was saying in the beginning that even today we don't really know. We can talk about it. I get asked a lot of times in conferences, so what do you think is going to happen in this decade? Technology. I say, I don't know. What should happen, I can tell you. But what will happen, I don't know. So these things, Google, Amazon, I think University of Cambridge, they've got together and formed something called the responsible use of artificial intelligence responsibly. And Facebook is also part of that. I actually have an issue with that. I don't think Google and they should be part of it because they were part of the problem and they would probably bring in biases. Anyway, they're part of that. So they're setting up regulations that how can data be protected? How can you be more informative about this black box, about the algorithms? So how can you give information? So if you are using a wealth management platform and you put in there $100 and you let the robot manage your wealth and he balances your portfolio and, you should now ask, what is he doing? How does he know? Which stocks is he going to choose? I have a platform. I didn't ask those questions. It's doing well, by the way. It's not doing bad. But now I can. So it's called fairness of algorithms. So they should be fair, that I should know why is this robot selecting this stock and not the other stock. So these things are happening. It's evolving. You'll never be sure. I think the way now talking about what's going to happen, I think the lot of focus in technology in the next, in this decade, blockchain aside, I have to say blockchain, everyone has to say blockchain, a lot will happen in blockchain, but security and how you can protect your identity when you are in open banking platforms, because it's dangerous, because you're open to 10 apps who have access to your data because you've allowed them. So that's happening. By the way, that's the other thing that's coming into the regulation, because there was a survey done of people who were asked, are you willing to give your data under the GDPR? And they say, yes, we are willing. So 90% said yes. Second question was, do you know what your data is used for? And 90% said no. So you should know what that data is being used for. So these are the questions you can start asking now. Hope it answers, Dr. Anas.
Thank you. Another question, please.
Thank you, Kaiser, for the talk, excellent talk. I have a question on sustainable development goals, SDGs. So about these SDGs, like governments all over the world, they have set up a separate department to implement that. Even UAE government also, I believe, they have a separate department to implement that. But there is not much awareness about these SDGs among private sector. Even if you do a quiz here, if you ask people here to tell 3 SDGs, I don't think you will get a good answer. So what can we do? Because private sector also, what can we do to get private sector involved in the implementation of the SDGs? Because we have a deadline of, I think, 2030.
Thank you. Good question. You should know 5 at least because I named them. The 5 SDGs everyone should know. Look, I'm a big believer, and you're absolutely right. Look, and it's not one country, by the way. So UAE may be on target. The world is not on target, and I've written about that. The world is not on target, and I frankly have my doubts that 2030 we will be meeting or hitting. There's 17 goals, but 160 targets to be met, and we're not near them. And the reason is because there are countries which are not even able to collect the data, even if they're doing something in food security or poverty alleviation. They are not able to collect that data. And there's a way that this data is collected and reported, and there's an annual report published by UNIDO, by the UN, on how close we are to the targets. And the report also says we're not on targets. And we have less than 10 years now. And what I've read of the report and what I've seen in Davos and what I see, and a lot of it has to do with education as well, that people are not aware how to embed it. A lot of what I am doing, by the way, it just happened that way. When I started talking to businesses just 2-3 weeks ago, a lot of businesses, and I didn't even know that was a niche, want advice on how they can align their business targets with SDGs. So businesses have started thinking about that. So I think articulation, you need to have a platform like this. I think this is an excellent platform where you bring in people and tell them why it is necessary, what those SDGs are, and also the fact that not everyone has to hit all 17 SDGs. You pick an SDG. My favorite SDG is financial inclusion. Financial inclusion, for example, and gender equality, and there are 2 more actually, food security, but all to do with technology. There's number 7 actually is about innovation and ICT. So that's a SDG one company can take and say, okay, we're going to hit that SDG. So I think that's how we have to go about it. But again, it's articulation and education. And I think Yoga, you're hosting this Dubai Business Breakfast. It's a voluntary thing. He has a platform. So I think you should do a series on SDGs going forward, because the type of people who come there are people who would benefit from that.
Any questions, comments?
I'll just add my thanks again to the organizers, to the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies Research. And again, I'll just reiterate that I think this is an excellent platform. And articulation, that's something I've been doing for the last 3, 4, 5 years, is getting the message across. And I've done it in various sectors. I did it in corporate governance, like I was saying. I've done it in SMEs. That used to be the flavor of the decade 10 years ago, why companies and why SMEs are important. So this is the way when you can create and raise awareness among individuals. And again, the countries are unequal. So there are countries which have never even heard of SDGs. They won't even know what an SDG is. And unless they are on board, you will never meet the goals. So let all of us be ambassadors or carrying this message. And for those of us who are actually running businesses, running entities, running institutions, or running governments, how can we, in what our aims and goals are in terms of that business, embed one of the SDGs in it? Simple one is you have more women represented on your board, for example. Another one is financial inclusion. So today you're a bank, but you're doing 10% of the SME market. Why don't you do another 5%? And there's a reason you don't do it, because you don't know the risk for it. But the risk can be mitigated through technology. So use technology. So you hit the financial inclusion, that you've included another 5% of small businesses in the financial sector. So that's hitting an SDG. So this is the way, but there needs to be an understanding of how to do that. So again, thank you very much, ECSSR, and for you people to be here, right after work. Thank you.
At the end of today's lectures and on behalf of His Excellency,
By the end of today,
Mr. Kaiser Naseem for his lecture, as well as the members of our audience for their participation. Thank you.